All right, so we're going to do the last presentation of Unit 4, which is going to be plant life cycles. There's quite a bit of information here. So the big thing is, number one, remember that you can go back and replay this as many times as possible, or that you need. Number two, if you have questions over anything during this presentation or as you're doing your reviewing or filling out your notes outline, be sure you write those down and email me, or leave a comment on Google Classroom, and I'll be sure to get to answer those. And also be aware of the key vocab that we point out during this as well, and understanding how certain things fit together. All right, so meiosis and fertilization. So with plants, we are going to talk about sexual reproduction. Okay, so in order for us to discuss that, then we need to understand meiosis and how that plays into fertilization. Meiosis is going to be extremely similar to mitosis, with the exception being the daughter cells and which cells go through meiosis. So remind yourselves that all cells go through mitosis except sex cells. Sex cells, which are going to be your gametes or your sperm and egg cells, replicate through meiosis. Okay? And then the combination of a male and female sex cell, or male and female gamete, is fertilization. So meiosis is the production of 4 genetically different haploid cells. Okay, haploid, we've discussed what haploid and diploid mean, but let's review it. So haploid means that these cells have half of the required chromosomes needed for a fully functioning cell. Okay, so think about half haploid, and it's going to be signified as a N in some situations. All right, so those cells become gametes. Fertilization is the joining of 2 haploid cells in order to form a diploid cell called a zygote. Diploid means it has all of the chromosomes needed for that cell to be functioning, and it's going to be symbolized by 2N. All right, so we talk about plant life cycles. We talk about alternation of generations. Okay, plants kind of jump back and forth between multiple different spots of life, so to speak. So let's look at those. So plants alternate between sporophyte and gametophyte generation. The sporophyte generation is going to be diploid, and this is where the haploid spores are going to be produced, and these spores are going into gametophytes. The gametophytes is haploid, and then there's you see the N that produces gametes, which are the sperm and egg. Sperm and egg combine to make a zygote. The zygote is going to be diploid. That's what 2N means. And the zygote grows into a sporophyte. All plants demonstrate some form of this life cycle. So this is kind of like a summary of plant life cycles. Now, remember, we talked about multiple different classifications of plants. So there is some variation also, based off of whether they're seed bearing or not, whether they're vascular or not, whether they produce fruits and flowers or not. So all of those things are going to play into this alternation of generation life cycle. But in long story short, so to speak, all plants are going to go through this cycle in some capacity. So we'll start with the bryophytes. Remember bryophytes, we talked about mosses, was the best example of this. So bryophytes must have water to reproduce. The sperm cells must swim to the egg. Okay, so that's why when we talk about bryophytes, how they have to live in moist areas. Okay, the water is necessary for them to reproduce. All right, so the steps of the bryophyte life cycle. Spores are going to be produced on the sporangium, which is the capsule section of the mature sporophyte. So if we look at the mature sporophyte, which is this antenna-looking deal, this capsule at the top is going to be the sporangium. Okay. Each spore, I have left out an O in that. Sorry, each spore either grows into a male gametophyte, which is called an antheridia, or a female gametophyte, which is called an archegonia. Those are 2 important terms to know. Okay, so if you're asked on the test, what is an antheridia, you should know that it's a male gametophyte. Okay, the male and female gametophytes produce sperm and egg cells, which combine in the archegonia to make a zygote. The zygote grows into a mature sporophyte on top of the female gametophyte. Okay. The bottom part down here, what looks like grass, okay, this is going to be the female gametophyte of bryophytes. All right, so then we'll move into ferns. fern life cycle. So whereas the dominant stage in mosses or bryophytes is the gametophyte stage, in ferns it's the sporophyte stage. While mosses have two separate gametophyte structures, the fern, man, I misspelled that too. The fern contains one that has both the antheridia and the archegonia. So the steps of the fern life cycle. In ferns, a single structure contains both the male and female gametophyte. The gametophytes produce the sperm and egg, which combine to make a zygote. The zygote grows into a mature sporophyte, and the sporophyte produces spores, which are able to grow into the gametophyte structure. So let's go back for just a minute, okay? So there's a lot of similarities between the fern life cycle and the bryophyte life cycle. The big difference being that a single structure contains both male and female gametophytes on ferns, whereas in bryophytes, if we go back and we look and remind ourselves, you have two different structures in bryophytes, whereas in ferns you have one structure. Okay, so not as much travel has to occur for sexual reproduction to happen, but once fertilization happens and a zygote is produced, the process is very similar to that of bryophytes. So then we move into gymnosperms. Remember, gymnosperms are vascular seed-bearing plants, but they don't have flowers or fruits. So the gametophyte in seed-bearing plants are not as apparent as they are in seedless plants. All right, so most gymnosperms, we look at, they have cones. Okay, they have male and female cones, or otherwise known as seed cones and pollen cones. So let's look at those a little bit closer. So the seed cone is also known as a female cone, which contains two structures near its base called ovules. These produce the haploid gametophytes, which in turn create the egg cells. So when we think about pine cones, 99.9% of the time you're thinking about the seed cone or the female cone of pine trees. Okay. The pollen cone, the male cone produces pollen grains, which are the male gametophytes. These pollen grains contain haploid cells, which will later create sperm cells. Very short or a lot smaller window in which we see these pollen cones, which are very small. Sometimes we wouldn't even consider them as cones. They're not always there. Okay, they're there just during the reproduction phase, so to speak, of these gymnosperms. And then down here on the bottom right-hand side, this is just a microscopic picture of pollen. And then we have a cross section of a female seed-bearing cone, and you can see how much nutrients and seeds are within this newly fertilized female cone. So the gymnosperm life cycle. The male gametophytes, which is pollen, and the female gametophytes combine, and the sex cells combine to form a zygote. The zygote will develop into a seed on the female cone. The tree later releases these seeds, which will grow to be mature sporophytes. And those seeds could be dropped directly beneath where the tree is, or it could be traveled by wind, animals, sometimes shoes or clothing. Um, there's different ways that seeds can be transported. We'll talk about when we get to angiosperms more. The male cone produces the pollen, which produces the sperm, and the female cones produce the ovule, which in turn is responsible for producing the egg, which will be fertilized by the sperm. So then we move into angiosperms. And remember that angiosperms represent the largest classification and the most diverse classification of plants on Earth. This is any type of plant that produces flowers or fruits. So with the angiosperms, one of the biggest things to understand and know is flower anatomy. Okay. So there's a nice little picture here. I would suggest you pausing and either drawing this or if you're doing virtual notes, find a picture of the labeled parts of a flower and put that in your notes, okay? And be sure that each of these are on there because in the next slide, we're going to talk about what each of them are. And that's very important for where we're at right now in this unit. So flowers are the primary reproductive organ of angiosperms, with each flower containing both the male and female gametophytes within the same flower. So flower anatomy, okay, the stamen, which is made of the anther and the filaments, produce the male gametophyte or the pollen grain. The carpel, which is made of the stigma, style, and ovary, produces the female gametophyte from structures called ovules inside the ovaries. Then you have this thing known as an embryo sac. Okay, so on the ovule, a cell undergoes meiosis, leaving only one of the four produced cells. That cell divides three times for a total of 8 cells, and it is closed and is enclosed by a membrane. This structure is the embryo sac. Uh, one that should be one, not I. One cell is a big typo. All right, so one cell is going to be the egg, and the other two are going to be called polar nuclei, which are eventually going to provide nutrients for the developing seed. Sepals are the leaf-like structures below the petals, and they protect the flower as a bud and in early stages of development. And petals can be many colors, and they attract insects for the purpose of pollination. And we'll talk more about how important pollination is as we move through future units. All right, so the angiosperm life cycle. So the process of meiosis creates pollen grains on the stamen and embryo sacs in the carpel, and these are the male and female gametophytes. So we're going to transition between those two. Pollination occurs and pollen comes into contact with the ovule, eventually leading to double fertilization. That's an important vocab term. So let's talk about what double fertilization is. So here you have first fertilization and second fertilization. First fertilization is when a sperm cell combines with the egg cells to produce the diploid zygote, which will develop into the sporophyte. Second fertilization is when a sperm cell will combine with the two polar nuclei, forming a triploid endosperm, triploid being 3N. Okay? The endosperm provides nourishment for the seed as it grows. These two structures combined will make up the seed. So you have the zygote, and then around the zygote inside the seed capsule, you'll have the endosperm, which will provide the nutrients for the seed to survive until it can germinate. As the seed matures, the ovary wall will thicken in order to form the fruit. Fruit is eaten, or it should be falls off, and eventually leads to germination, which is the growth of a new plant from a seed. So again, the definition of germination is the growth of a new plant for a seed. Now, these seeds can be transported by animals when animals eat fruit. A lot of times, those fruit contain seeds. The seeds don't digest, they move right on through the animal. So, wherever the animal is, when it's time to remove waste, a lot of times the seeds are dropped amongst a healthy supply of fertilizer and animal waste. Wind can blow some of these. We see that with dandelions, we see it with milkweeds. There's a lot of different types of seeds that are transported by wind, and water can also move these. We talk about erosion sometimes. It's not uncommon for newly dropped seeds to be carried by water to other parts of an environment or ecosystem to grow and germinate. All right, so the new plant is the sporophyte, which will eventually mature and produce gametes. Okay, the only thing I really want to show you with this picture here is you see a monocotyledon and a dicotyledon. We've talked about both of those. Okay, and we see here the two cotyledons inside of the dicot, di meaning two, and then you see an endosperm. Okay, well, if you look over here at a monocot, okay, monocot, you're going to have one cotyledon, a single cotyledon, and then it still also has an endosperm. Okay, so remember, the endosperm is going to provide those nutrients needed by the seed to survive long enough to germinate and begin to grow roots and grow as a plant. And that is the end of Unit 4. So be sure if you have questions to let me know. I'll be sure to answer them and be looking for your vocab review and your notes outline to begin preparing for your test. Thank you.